Hello there, it's really good to have you with me as we take a look at another psalm. And today we're looking at a real epic of a psalm. We're in Psalm 78. It's the second longest psalm in the whole book of Psalms, second only, of course, to Psalm 119. It's one of at least four historical psalms that we have. There's this one, then there's 105, 106, and 136. And what this psalm does is it recites God's dealings with his people, both in anger and mercy. And it calls on God's people not to be like their fathers in the past, but to remember and to obey God's teachings. It seems to me there are clearly three sections in this long psalm. First of all, verses 1 to 8 is an introduction. God's people are called to listen to the teaching of God as given in the scriptures and to teach it and to pass it on to future generations. But most importantly, it stresses that the purpose of that teaching, of that instruction, is not simple knowledge of facts or memorization of historical facts. It's growth in faith and in obedience. Notice how it says it in verse 7, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. Or as the old hymn puts it, trust and obey. That's a simple call of this psalm. Based on God's revelation of himself and his dealings with people, his people are called to trust him, to put their hope in him, and to obey him, to keep his commandments. And the rest of the psalm then divides into two parallel sections, each of them recounting how the previous generations did not trust and obey, and how God responded both in anger and in mercy. So you have 9 to 39, and then you have 40 to 72. And each section follows exactly the same pattern and repeats some of the same terminology. That's why I'm calling them two parallel sections. Let me show you how it works. Verses 9 to 11, and then again in 40 to 42, there's the account of God's people rebelling. That's followed in verses 12 to 16, and again 43 to 55, by God's mercy towards his people. And in both situations, there's a repetition of references to the land of Egypt and the fields of Zoan. And then in verses 17 to 20, and again in 56 to 58, God's people rebelled against the Most High, and that name is repeated in both sections. So God's people rebelled, God was merciful, God's people rebelled again against the Most High. And then 21 to 33, and again 59 to 64, God heard and was angry with his people. And then that's followed in the last of each section, 34 to 39, and again in 65 to 72. In the first one, God responds by providing forgiveness. In the second section, he responds by choosing Zion and David. And as if by way of example, Asaph the psalmist here seems to single out one of the tribes, the tribe of Ephraim. He recounts in verses 9 to 11 how, despite being equipped for the work, they failed and forgot God's works, refusing to walk in obedience to his word. It's not insignificant that when we get to verse 60, the mention here is of God's rejection of Shiloh as the place of his tabernacle's presence. Shiloh is in the territory of Ephraim. And in verses 67 to 68, he rejects Ephraim in favor of Judah and Jerusalem. It's a lesson to us there of the loss of blessing and privilege when we don't trust and obey. And this is a psalm of repeated contrasts. It's described in words like yet in verses, which comes 4 times. Phrases like in spite of, that we have in verse 32. God is merciful and good to Israel, yet they forget his works and his word. Israel sins against God, and yet he is merciful and good to them. Israel's rebellion was in spite of all God's works and teachings. But what this important psalm makes so clear to us is a lack of obedience is the consequence of a lack of faith. Look at verse 22. Verse 21, when the Lord heard, he was full of wrath. His fire was kindled against Jacob, his anger rose against Israel, because they did not believe in God and did not trust his saving power. What a damning statement about God's own people. They did not believe in God. They didn't trust God. I wonder whether that could also be said about us as professing Christians. We have far more teaching, far more instruction from God than the people of old ever had. We have far more evidence and experience of his acts of undeserved mercy and kindness to us than ever they did. But are we any more obedient? Are we really any more believing? Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. The Lord bless you and the Lord keep you.